feel like God's the absentee father who went to the store when I was 10 to grab some cigarettes but then never came back. How could there be no inherent meaning to life? That just seems self-defeating, and I refuse to believe that the connection I have with my kids is just neurons firing to promote my genetic survival or something like that. Like I don't think we're just these featherless biped chimps floating on a rock in space. Like we are that, but we've got to be more. She said, "You think everything happens for a reason? Like you think my husband's death was part of God's plan, or you think that it's God's will that my son grows up without his dad?" And it's hard for me to relate to a virgin who never sinned. Like sex and mistakes is like half of my personality. Of the churches and communities I was a part of, one just fizzled out because of apathy, and one was wrecked by a situation involving a minor, and one exploded in a violent split that ended with the church literally getting burned to the ground. And of my closest friends, one ghosted me, another dropped off the face of the earth, another two close friends passed from depression, and another became an alcoholic, and another, and you can't even make this up, but it turns out the name we knew him by wasn't even his real name, and he was on the FBI's most wanted list. So it just seems like, why do anything at all if all your communities fizzle out at best or blow apart at worst, and all your friends either move or disappear or die? And I ended up becoming extremely depressed, like mornings where my 1-year-old is crying in his crib for over an hour for me to get him up, and I can't make myself get out of bed just because I can't find any meaning in anything or motivation or reason to do anything. I just wanted some kind of validation that God was there or that he cared. Like I'd take a hug or a punch, but just getting nothing was really hard. And this all sounds hella depressing, and it kinda is, but I promise there is a happy ending, and now I do really believe that. So this is the Lifted Spirits Podcast, and the purpose of this podcast is how to find meaning in our day-to-day lives in practical ways, not in these grand cosmic ways, but I thought we could at least do one where we zoom all the way out and take a more comprehensive and universal look at things. And if you're primarily interested in theology and philosophy and apologetics and science, that's going to be part 2, and you can just head there. But if you're interested in the human condition and the deepest parts of a person's being and stories of life and death and joys and regrets and how my real-world experience kind of crushed my soul, but coming out of that wreckage, I found peace and meaning and purpose. That's what part 1 is about, the emotional and experiential arguments and less the logical ones. And I have a pretty unique experience that's given me a unique vantage point because I've been an extremely devout Christian, but I've also been very deeply nihilistic and atheistic, and neither of those extremes worked out very well for me. But before we jump in, if you find this interesting, please subscribe below. It's the thing you can do to help most with the channel, because I didn't want to dumb down the intense themes and events in this video, so there's a 0% chance that it will get monetized. And if you won't do it for me, at least do it for our dog, Oakley. Anyway, I know there are a lot of complex ideas you can explore that have infinite depth, but I'm a big fan of being able to get to the point, then delve into all the detail from there. So I thought I'd start with explaining why I have a hard time with both Christianity and atheism and some overarching bullet points, and then go into all the detail from there. So here it goes. One, with Christian community, i.e. church, it just doesn't seem to work in the modern Western world. Like friendships are non-committal and fleeting, and every community you're a part of seems to fizzle out at best or explode with some kind of split or scandal at worst. And pretty much every personal problem like depression and loneliness, and every societal problem like poverty and crime all seem to be downstream of not being a part of a deeply loving and committed community. And the fact that even the best Christians are so awful at creating community makes me doubt the whole enterprise. 2, God seems very distant and impersonal. Like things just seem to happen, and there sure doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason as to why. And if God does care, he seems about as good at showing it as the average boomer dad. Like modern humanity's been around for roughly 300,000 years, and for most of that time, humans lived in very ruthless conditions and often died extremely brutal and painful deaths, especially children. And that's just really hard to square with a personal, loving God who only decided to send his son about 298,000 years into modern human history. And 3, the most problematic part of the story of Jesus to me is that I don't know how to relate to a virgin who never sinned. Like, I don't even mean that as a joke. Like, genuinely, what do our human experiences have in common if your life hasn't been just riddled by mistakes, you know? It's hard to relate to a God like that. But moving on to atheism, my first main issue with it is like, how could there be no inherent meaning to life? That seems really self-defeating, and I refuse to believe that the connection I have with my kids is just neurons firing to promote my genetic survival. Like, I don't think we're just these featherless biped chimps floating on a rock in space. Like, we are that, but we've got to be more than just that. And two, it seems really impossible to have any kind of moral foundation without some sort of divine or eternal purpose. Like, obviously, if there's no God, most people wouldn't just run around murdering people, but there'd be much less incentive against living an extremely selfish life that prioritizes your comfort and pleasure above others. And I can already see the vein popping in some people's foreheads with these claims and with all sorts of objections, so let's just hop in. And I'll start by sharing some about myself, because I want this video to be about the actual content, but it's helpful to know a bit about where I'm coming from. So on the Christian front, I've been thoroughly immersed in various forms of Christianity. I grew up evangelical. I spent 5 years at an Eastern Orthodox church. I have a long history with the Amish and Mennonites, and I've been connected with gay-affirming communities that have lady priests, so I've seen it all, liberal, conservative, whatever. And I've also read through the Ante-Nicene Fathers, which is a primary source 10-volume set on the first 300 years of Christianity. It's actually like back there. Probably can't see it from here. But yeah, like a lot of people don't know about this, but just like Jesus had disciples that wrote letters, Peter and Paul and John and the apostles, they also had disciples who wrote letters and so on and so on. And so I read through these very slowly and meticulously over the course of like 5 years, because I'd study each document really in depth. And I also dropped out of college for a lot of reasons, but the main one was to explore religion and meaning full time. Like, I mean, I had a minimum wage job, but I only worked a few days a week and lived super cheap and split a room and slept on a blow up camping mat on the floor, so pretty ascetic. And I visited a different group every other week. Like, I'd hang with the Mormons one week, then I'd go and chill with the imam at the mosque, and I'd spend time touring the local Hindu temple, and actually just interviewed their priest a few months back. And I went to several Occam's Razor meetings, which is the college atheist group, and I'd have lunch with their director, and I even turned the tables on the Jehovah's Witnesses and went knocking on their church door and seeing if I could ask some questions. So I did all this with the genuine question, like, what is the truth? Like, I definitely had my biases, but I was trying as hard as I could to set them aside and approach ideas based on their merit. Which, quick side note, if you want to learn about a group, please learn about it from their organization, their leaders, their people, not some Christian apologetics book about them. There's so much horrifically wrong information about other faiths in Christian books, and I could tell so many embarrassing stories, but this is already a long video, so I'll save those for another time. So I've read the Bible like 8 times, cover to cover, in various translations. I've read the entire Quran. I've read through the Mahabharata, which is the Hindu text, and I've read pretty much every ancient apocryphal Hebrew Christian text, so I'm a reasonably informed person when it comes to religion as a whole, and I don't even say that to like pat myself on the back, because as I'll get into later, it's like I wish I would have done a lot of other things with my life than study religion, like just connect with people. So that's not as much a flex as like I see it as embarrassing now. Like in high school, I could have spent less time reading the Bible during my lunch breaks, and I could have been sitting with the kid who didn't have any friends, But my wife and I went to an Eastern Orthodox church for 5 years, which is like the most traditional you can get. So we legitimately have a healthy respect for tradition and hierarchy, and wish so badly for a while that we could just commit to a religious institution, even though we ultimately never did. But I just say that to show off we aren't these lone wolf cowboy religious nutcases with outlandish opinions. Like, we want to be team players really badly, but we also feel like our critiques of Christianity are reasonably warranted. Anyhow, that's a bit about my religious credentials, but I've also listened to and read thousands of hours of atheist books and podcasts, Dawkins and Harris and Hitchens and Ehrman and Alex O'Connor and all those guys. And some of my closest friends, including my brothers, are atheists that are well-read and intelligent and articulate, and they're not even the bitter, aggressive atheist type. They've just examined the Christian faith as they know it and other religions and ask legitimately good questions and have decided, I don't think I believe in this. And more importantly than just consuming skeptic content, I ended up becoming extremely nihilistic and atheistic and depressed for about 2 years, which I had a friend that I was talking to about this recently, and they said, nihilistic, what does that mean? So if you're not familiar with that term, it just means like the idea that nothing matters and the universe is pointless. But it was a slow bleed for several years leading up to that period, and I was pretty fully immersed in that cynicism for about 2 years, and I was bitter and angry and felt like nothing mattered, and if there was a God, he'd abandoned this world a long time ago, and I couldn't get out of bed a lot of times, like I wasn't taking care of my kid. I completely missed extremely important work commitments. I started having concerning health issues with my heart for the first time, and my life and my mind basically unraveled. And I felt pretty justified in how I felt because for 14 years I was totally and utterly sold out to the cause of God. Like I'd sacrificed so much of my time and money and energy and relationships and hope to fix Christianity and rebuild more authentic Christian community and church in America, but I was 14 years in and felt like I was farther away from that goal than where I started. And I also experienced a lot of traumatic losses, both in like the death of individuals and the death of groups that I loved. And just to give a broad overview of those experiences that really started to choke out my faith, like of my closest friends, one ghosted me and dropped off the face of the earth. I still haven't heard from him 5 years later. And that was one of the hardest to recover from emotionally because he was older than me and was like a spiritual mentor of sorts. So it was just hard to bounce back from. And another two close friends passed from depression and suicide on the same, I found out on the same week, and so and my wallet got stolen. It was a bad week. But another moved and stopped texting or calling back. Another became an alcoholic, and you can't make this part up, but it turns out another one, like the name we knew him by wasn't even his real name, and he was on the FBI's most wanted list, and he got caught. So he's in prison now. And the two that passed from suicide and depression, I know that I can't hold churches or Christianity or myself responsible for that, but part of me feels like people wouldn't find themselves in that situation if they felt like they truly belonged somewhere in a tight-knit community. So I do still feel a lot of like pressure and like maybe even a healthy guilt, like this is a problem that has to get fixed because if it doesn't, this is just going to keep happening, and we're all going to, America's just zoinked out on meds by and large already. But just the fact that overall churches are anything but a city on a hill, so to speak, makes me doubt the whole enterprise. And I have a lot of atheist or non-religious friends that have stronger community than most Christians I know, and that began to really take a serious toll on my faith. Like the center point of Christianity is the communion of the saints, tight-knit community with people you love, and if non-Christians seem to be accomplishing that goal better than Christians, what does it say about the value of religion as a whole, Yeah, because of the churches and communities I was a part of, one just fizzled out because of apathy, and one was wrecked by a child molestation case, and one exploded in a violent split that ended with the church literally getting burned to the ground. Wild, And that church split was like a divorce custody battle. I was like 20 or 21, and I was torn between these groups of people that were aggressively trying to convince me to be on their side, which was really heart-wrenching because I had done life with these people and really loved all of them, and I was being forced to pick like which people I had to stay with, which parent, And oddly enough, this church that blew up had been one of my best church experiences ever, so it hurt all the more. Like, I don't know, I remember in the midst of all the fighting during the split, that was the first time I ever wondered, what if like none of this is real, like God or religion or any of it? Like I had my questions before, but the details of God and religion and would read apologetics book, but I legitimately never questioned if the whole thing was just entirely untrue. So that really rocked my world. And a lot of things, other things happened over time, but if there was a single breaking point, it would have been Easter 2021. It was a rough day, and I'll tell that story later, but that's when I consciously decided, like, I quit. I'm done. I've been giving my all to this for literally more than half my life, and it's just made everything worse, it seems, and God doesn't listen to any of my prayers about any of this, so I'm finished. And this is really awful, but for 2 years, this mantra of sorts just played in my mind multiple times a day. I'm going to sound like a terrible person, but like, I can't help, it's what was there, and it just said, like, fuck everyone, fuck everything. Like, it's not like I even wanted to think that. It's just, it was like a separate, nasty, cynical voice just ringing in my head. And it was maybe the dark side of how I felt deep down. And I'll get more into later, like how I got that depressed. Like, that's pretty depressed and pretty cynical and pretty nihilistic. But I'm just trying to give broad overview for now. So I eventually worked my way out of that more nihilistic atheism, sort of out of necessity, so I could just function and become more regular atheist agnostic, not hella depressed, unstable, 1,000-yard stare into the abyss atheist agnostic. And I got a lot of that help I needed from my wife, Alexis. She's been a lifesaver in so many ways, and I have great family and great kids that have been incredibly helpful in direct and indirect ways. And for now, I've been doing like really good for about 3 years. So that's a bird's eye view of my life and story. We can hone in on some of the details and rewind a little bit, because the reason I fell so hard was because I had such high hopes for what Christianity could potentially deliver. So what was that vision? So for a long time as a Christian, I actually really empathized with the atheist perspective, but it was kept at bay because the vision that Christianity offered for the world and for community was just so compelling, and atheism didn't seem to have an alternative vision. Like, atheism could tear down religious ideologies pretty well, but didn't seem to have much that it could build on to fill that void. And what was the Christian vision? Like, it was pretty ingrained in me from a pretty young age. Like, when I was 14, I had this spiritual awakening of sorts and got super radical about my faith and became a part of a church group in ninth grade called Mission 245. And it was based on Acts 2:45, which reads, now all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily. And I wasn't trying to be a dick, but at one point I'd ask the group, like, why are we called this? Because we're literally not doing a single one of these things. And I was just like trying to be consistent. And I became enamored with this vision of community in the early church, and because it was like a communism of sorts, but one that wasn't being enforced by the government, but one that people were like voluntarily being a part of because they just believed like in making sure that everyone was taken care of. And that was a really inspiring vision to me. So even at that young age, I saw that like this community church thing was the solution to quite literally everything. Like, wars and violent crime happen because people don't have enough of something and feel like they have to fight for resources. And a lot of depression comes from just feeling like you're aimless and don't have anyone to share life with and help you channel your goals and skills and passions. And a lot of financial stress comes from being these atomized, individualistic Americans, who have all of our own things and don't need to have any sort of financial safety net for medical emergencies or losing a job or whatever. And a lot of divorces happen because a husband and wife is now supposed to take on all of the emotional and domestic weight that used to be shared among a community. And when I say domestic, I just mean like couples used to have a lot more communal help for childcare and chores and things like that. And men in particular get weird and violent when they become isolated, an obvious problem in the modern world. And you can go down the line. There's hardly any human problem that wouldn't be mostly solved if everyone felt like they were genuinely a part of a loving community. So I became really obsessed with this vision, and my faith in God and Christianity became really inextricably tied to this vision, because if God is love and love is the deepest spark of connection between people, then the more distant we get from people, the more distant we get from God. And I'm just a ruthlessly practical person and could never be satisfied with all of the church folk talking like we were so different from everybody, when in reality our personal lives and communal lives were basically the same as anyone else's. And I just can't do that kind of cognitive dissonance. Because that communal vision in Acts of meeting regularly and having all things in common and doing life together was the beginning of the Christian church, not like the final form or something, because Christians would play it off like more communally oriented church was SEAL Team 6 Christianity, like something only super serious Christians did. Whereas I was thinking, nah, this is like square one. Like if we're not doing community well, forget about Bible study or evangelism or worship nights or debating theological hot topics or whatever. So a Christian group's level of community became my litmus test for how interested I was in it. Like there were several groups that were way more liberal than I'd prefer, way more conservative than I'd prefer, but if they did community well, I'd tend to hang around with them more than I would with people that I agreed with more on paper. And one of the main issues I ran into pursuing this vision of Christian community was that we're so far downstream of that ideal that you have to be a bit militant and determined to swim upstream and get to that idealistic community. Like you can't just have people that are like, oh yeah, that sounds cool. It'd be great if we had more community. Like you have to have people that are willing to put some blood, sweat, and tears into building a foundation from the communal rubble we've been left with in the West. And like I was a part of a house church for about 3 years that was also one of my best experiences, and there was no sense of like coercion or control, but it could also be lackadaisical where people miss often, and you go from meeting a few times a week to meeting once a week to meeting every other week to just sporadically meeting throughout the year, and that group eventually just fizzled out because everyone felt like there wasn't enough chemistry and vision to keep it rolling. And part of me gets that, like you've got your own life, you've got your own commitment, but then the other part of me thinks, like, do you guys not understand the fucking situation we're in? Like, this isn't really optional. Like, it's societal sink or swim. If we don't correct this by 2100, we're all going to be zoinked out of our minds on depression meds and getting assisted suicides by the time we're 40. And it's not like the thing we have to do is even some chore or dreadful thing. Like it's literally just friendship with a common vision to help each other and help the world around you. And just why is that so damn hard to come across? Like church can and should be having a group of people that you do life with, people that you share meals with several times a week, people who know your fears and your dreams and are helping you avoid pitfalls and accomplish goals, people who are your safety net spiritually, financially, emotionally. And like, this is what everyone wants, right? Like, am I crazy? When I talk to people, they're always like, if we only had some sort of version of this thing that I just described, like everyone wants it. And churches often have life groups and talk about intentional community and missional community, but it ultimately winds up with having a group that you maybe meet with weekly and rehashing a Bible study that you've already done 1,000 times if you grew up in church. And I was a part of a church group for a year and a half, and I hardly got to know anything about these people's personal lives. Like sometimes we'd have dinner and maybe be right about to get into some interesting territory, but then it's time to start the lifeless Bible study. And it's really not that I'm obsessed with my vision of church or even the idea of community of self. I would think so, I'm biased like anyone else. But it's genuinely just because I care about people. Like I see all these problems in my life and in other people's lives and think, this would be so different if we just had a little more of a place to lay our heads, Like, again, isn't this what we all really want? Like, I just want people to be okay and feel like they belong somewhere. But the search for community is kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand you have the flaky, lackadaisical people who can't commit to community, and on the other hand you have more determined and militant people who can get shit done. But the problem is they're more likely to have their own strong opinions about what exactly community should look like, and they're more likely to try to enforce those opinions on others. I obviously fall a bit more into that camp, but over time I've just become wildly uninterested in forcing anybody to do anything. Like I have such a low bar. Like I just want people who are available and interested in hanging out. Like that's about it. And because it should be said that over all these years, when I say we can't find community, me and my wife and I, it's not like we're living in isolation. Like we're constantly going to church events, trying to connect with people at churches, having people over, but it's just hard to find friendships where you're seeing someone more than once every few months. And the friendships we have had and do have, like I'm obviously incredibly thankful for and love those people, but I wouldn't call them divinely established, you know? So it's like, how does this bear on the validity of Christianity as a whole? But as far as more determined church groups, I found a pretty great church in my early 20s that really did life together and shared burdens and shared meals. But as good as that was, that community was eventually torn apart by religious dogma. But in its prime, this church was pretty impressive. Like they didn't even have an offering box because just everyone knew what was going on in people's lives, and the main pastor had a full-time job and, you know, supported himself, and if anyone was struggling, they'd all just work some overtime and pitch in to cover medical bills or debt or whatever. And they'd have a communion meal every Sunday night where you'd hang out and eat all night, and like there was an open mic time to just share what's going on with your life, like your joys or struggles or whatever, just updates. And they'd have dinners at each other's houses pretty much every other night, and they'd do community service events all the time and help people move who maybe didn't have the resources, or they'd visit nursing homes before work in the morning just to brighten people's days. And they ran businesses together, and they were just super coordinated. And they'd also share emotional loads, like your husband left you and you need somewhere where you can have connection and your kids can be with others, and or, you know, God forbid, if your wife died and you need community to rally around you and support you. Like they basically were their own social security. And that's, in my mind, like what Christianity is at its best. Just determined, committed community with a common vision to make a difference together in the world. But the problem seems to be that finding communities like that is just so damn hard. And when you finally do, they never last. Like even when it's the top of the line Christians, it seems like you get to that level of community and commitment, and there almost has to be a cult-like fear element to keep it together. Like you're banding together to fight against the world or save people from hell or something like that. And that always leads to power struggles and problems that ruin everything. So yeah, it's like this catch-22, because the best chill, quote-unquote nice guy Christians are too impotent to make a difference, but then the best determined militant type Christians end up letting things get to their head and they ruin everything for everybody. So the fact that even the best Christians are so awful at creating community really started to erode my faith and made me just doubt everything. So I don't know, it just seems like church should be a place where you walk in and you don't have to doubt that whoever or whatever God is, he's there. Like a place where people are thriving and fully alive and fully human, and where people are connected, and the music and liturgy is moving and thoughtful, and the sermons are inspiring, and the holidays and celebrations are vibrant and like something people actually want to be a part of. And that's obviously just not at all what you get out of most every church. And ultimately, I don't know, everyone wants to find meaning in life that's personal, but also universal, that helps you and others like find your place in the world, because people are just so lonely. And I always saw Christianity as the solution to the loneliness epidemic, because, I don't know, Christianity just offers one of the most compelling reasons for our place in the universe, and also offers one of the most compelling visions for community of any religion or philosophy, and that I know of. And it would serve as just this antidote to the meaning crisis and the loneliness epidemic that's plaguing the West. But the problem is that Christianity just doesn't seem to work in most places anymore. Like Christians are just as individualistic and non-committal when it comes to community as any other demographic. So it all just feels like a castle in the sky religion of intangible ideas and thoughts and prayers, like trying to get a church group community to meet even just weekly can be like pulling teeth, much less like trying to do life together in a way that doesn't literally have to be every day, but at least in a way where you feel as though you're an integrated part of something. Like I often think, aside from my family and work commitments, if I just disappeared, how long would it take someone to notice? Like if we were just to use romantic analogies, modern Christianity seems to offer like hookup friendships, whereas Christianity, I think, is supposed to offer relationships that are more akin to marriage. And don't take that analogy too far, but I'm just saying that like Christians should have a deeper sense of commitment to their like people and their community. And what my wife and I found again and again was just constant canceling, lack of commitment, lack of vision. And I'd been a part of all these different kinds of Christian groups, and none of them could seem to be able to sustain vibrant community for very long. So yeah, I just started thinking, what's the point of all this? Like Jesus said, you'll know my disciples by the love they have for one another. And that's like the last thing these groups ended up being about. Like my two friends who passed of depression, suicide, were actually a part of the same church that had an explosive split. And I'll never forget at the funeral of one of them, his whole family are these like 6'4" and above burly cowboys. And to see all these big men just weeping like babies, like that's just something you don't forget. Like it was hard for me, but like just seeing that was rough. But the church split revolved around this guy's dad, and he wrestled a lot with that. Like maybe 2 months before he passed, we'd met up, and he was really struggling with his place in all of this, and people pulling him all these different directions. And which it should be said that over time it just became abundantly clear that his dad was in the right, and the people who were criticizing him were just these puritanical, power-hungry people. And again, I know I can't blame the church, and in any tragedy, the first thing we want to do is scapegoat and blame somebody for why we're suffering. But if I was honest with how I was feeling when I was at his funeral, I was just looking at all these people from both sides of this church split and thought, like, this is your fault. Like, you guys couldn't get your act together and be adults and work out your differences, and now look at the people who've been harmed from the shrapnel of that explosion. And I know that might not be fair or accurate, but it's just how I felt. And I'm remembering just now that like my other friend who passed, he left this church that had the split and moved states and found another church, and the church that he was going to just had a big split like a year or two ago. So it just feels like there's no winning. And I don't know. Let me take a second, because I'm probably sounding pretty negative, and you're probably thinking like, well, who would want to be in community with such a negative Nancy like me? Like maybe you're the problem. And I'm totally willing to admit my flaws and have really like been super conscious of that over time. But I really am a pretty positive and laid back person. Like when I was 20, I definitely wouldn't want to hang out with me. But like the past, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, I've been pretty normal and like I'm not aggressive. Like I'm positive and laid back. Like I just want to get shit done. And so if I sound frustrated, it's because this is like a culminated indictment, of our situation that's based on like 2 decades of my life experience. And at this point, I'm not really particular on any of the details of community other than it being quality time that's consistent. Like I'd probably prefer some kind of community that's at least Christian adjacent, but I'm not even set on that. Like I just love to find people that make time for each other. There's a Leonard Cohen song where he says, "I've always liked it slow, I've never liked it fast. For you, it's gotta go. For me, it's gotta last." And I just want to be a part of something that's enduring and lasts, like something that my kids can still be a part of when, if they want to, when they grow up. And what's ironic is that what I view as the dream life is kind of just what most every human had until modern times, like just living in a little village, even if it's in the heart of the city, where there's a strong sense of community, like you share meals in a communal space often, and there are shared holidays and celebrations, and there's a shared sense of who you are as a group and your values and the type of changes you want to bring about in the world. And there's maybe even some kind of square dancing at a pub in a little hobbit town, but I kind of worry that the pandemic forever put the final nail in the coffin of that dream for America, at least. Like, I know the pandemic was depressing for everyone, but it felt like it stung a bit extra for me since I was already having this existential crisis about community. Then to add to that, like, we're supposed to not even gather at all for a year and a half. And Bo Burnham is a comedian, if you don't know of him, and he made this documentary slash comedy slash musical special during the pandemic called Inside that all takes place in one room because it's kind of about lockdown. And at the crux of the film, in his most depressed time, he has a song where he says, you say the ocean's rising, like I give a shit. You say the whole world's ending, honey, it already did. You're not going to slow it. Heaven knows you tried. Got it? Good. Now get inside. It's very cynical, very nihilistic, but very honest. And I just listened to that on repeat for a few years. Like, when I say repeat, like at least 3 or 4 times a day for a year. And then after that is maybe like once a day. Because it's just like, I was so done with everything. And because before the pandemic, community in America was like an uphill battle, but now it's like a battle against gravity. And I've heard that Jesus's greatest miracle was that he had 12 close friends in his 30s, and unironically, I think that's actually true. Anyway, I could go on and on for hours about Christian community, but hopefully I've made that point of like we can move on to my next major issue with Christianity, and that is that whoever or whatever God is, God sure seems to be very distant and impersonal. Like, the universe seems to be a sort of deistic clock that was wound up and let go and then just kind of left alone for the most part. Like, one prime practical example would be the efficacy of prayer. Like, you pray for something and it happens and you say, God heard my prayer, but then you pray for something and it doesn't happen and you say, well, God's plans are mysterious. And people attribute this to all sorts of events, not to bring politics into it, but people will say God protected Trump from the gunman's bullet and it's God's plan that he survived, but what about the guy behind Trump who got shot? Like, was it part of God's plan that his daughters grow up without their dad? Like, the logic doesn't track. Or a defining moment for me with all this was like at a Bible study, and there was this young woman there who her husband had passed unexpectedly and left her alone with a 3-year-old boy. And at some point in the study, people were talking about prayer and providence, and she spoke up, and I don't remember her exact words, but she essentially said rather indignantly, like, you think that everything happens for a reason? Like, you think my husband's death was a part of God's plan? You think it's God's will that my son grows up without his dad? Like, she was really angry and incredulous about it all. And she also said something along the lines of how shallow and silly she thought Bible studies and community groups usually were. And it was pretty shocking because you just hardly ever hear anyone in any context be that raw and honest, but it was just like bubbling up in her and she couldn't stop from saying it. And everyone obviously understood after all she'd been through. And that's just another big part of why the lack of Christian community stuff bothers me so badly, because there's so many lonely people like that who need others to rally around them and be, I don't know, like, it just seems the best we can offer is maybe a weekly superficial Bible study. And on a personal level, when I first got married, I was really concerned because I was super Christian, but Alexis, my wife, hardly had any Christian girlfriends, and I prayed for years that she would even have one close Christian girlfriend, and prayed so hard for so long and did a bunch of fasts for it too, and like, it just never really happened. And again, I totally get people not wanting to hang out with me. I'm pretty weird and opinionated and all that, but she's super sweet and easy to be around, and she just has such a hard time finding girls, especially other moms, who want to have any sort of committed friendship other than meeting up every few months. And then the committed friends she did have at the time weren't Christian, and that always hurt me as a husband and a Christian at the time. I would think, like, this is not an absurd prayer request. Like, why does God seem to not care? It certainly wasn't from lack of trying. Like, she would go so far out of her way to connect with other Christian girls, but it's just never really worked out for her. And For myself, I would also pray extremely hard and fast to revive Christian community, and I was obsessed about it. Like, it was my main thing for most of my life, and I gave it everything I had for 14 years, basically like age 14 to 28, and God didn't seem to care about that either. Like, I sacrificed school and career, I dropped out of college, and I sacrificed a lot of relationships and my bank account and mental stability and so much more just to feel like I was still at square one and still had no support from a supposedly all benevolent and all-knowing being. Like, my whole life just felt like one big unanswered prayer. And I also lived at and managed a halfway house for 3 years and had 35 roommates in that time frame. And I lived with people from the streets and drug addicts and ex-convicts and people like that. And the positive element of that was that it really changed my perspective on who or even what God was. But I was a naive, bleeding heart and constantly letting myself get taken advantage of, like, especially financially, to the point where when I got married, I only had $300 in my account, which was pretty embarrassing. And I just prayed and prayed and prayed over this house, like this project. But I genuinely don't know if anyone who was there ended up better than where they started. Like, it just felt like I was giving everything for God, but not even getting the satisfaction of knowing that I was helping people. And I know you shouldn't do the right thing because you expect some kind of payoff, but it was just like, is this worthwhile? Like, is there a payoff for any of this, for anyone? Like, it's kind of one thing to get taken advantage of and have bad things happen to you unjustly. Like, that's what happened to Jesus and the apostles, but they at least did it for the sake of the communion of the saints, like the church and their community. But yet I still didn't have close Christian community, as hard as I tried to find it. So it made me wonder, like, why am I doing any of this, and what kind of God pays back this level of devotion with essentially no sign that he cares about the cause that he supposedly entrusted to you. And again, just to clarify, it's really not that, like, I wanted some payoff. Or, I mean, I can't pretend, there probably is some part of that, but it really is that I just wanted to see vibrant community happen so that we can reverse this American individualism and just all be okay. Like, that's it. So the distance of God became a personal problem to me, and I think it's also a cosmic problem. Like, I understand there are limits to what we can know about the origin of life and the history of our planet and things like that, but based on all relevant information, it seems clear that the Earth is billions of years old and that all life shares a common ancestor, which I now think is a pretty beautiful thing. But on one hand, you have fundamentalists who think, oh, evolution is the devil, and on the other hand, you have Christians who say, well, maybe God created everything, but he just did it through the evolutionary process, and that's no big deal. But it is kind of a big deal when you think about it, because modern humanity has supposedly been around for 300,000-ish years, and for most of that time, humans lived in just unbelievably ruthless conditions and often died extremely brutal and painful deaths, especially children, and that's just really hard to square with a personal, loving God. And then you layer on top of that God only decided to send his son about 298,000 years into the modern into history to, like, help alleviate some of this human-to-human suffering. And, like, could he have not given us clear guidance on how to make peace with each other sooner? I don't know. There just seems to be, there doesn't seem to be much providence, and things just seem to happen. There sure doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason as to why. And if God does care, he seems to be about as good at showing it as the average boomer dad. Like, one time when I was a teenager, I was discouraged that I kept sinning, and I really wanted to find God, wrestle like Abraham, maybe get some kind of blessing so I could actually be a better person. And even at that time, I had a much more naive and blind faith, but I still felt like God wasn't hearing my prayers, and I was fed up with all these hiding games he seemed to be playing. So I went to the top of this hill during a thunderstorm, bright idea, and I was just getting drenched and shouting at God just to like come out, like show like some kind of sign or proof, like hit me with lightning, come out and fight me. Like I'm 16 or something and hyped up on testosterone, and I just want to, just want to go. And all this happened, but like all that happened was there were some strong winds and like lightning everywhere, and a giant branch fell about 40 feet from me. And I remember shouting like, "Coward, like come out and face me, like, throw an actual punch, let's do this." Because at the time obviously wasn't fully aware of what was going on inside of me, but in retrospect, I know that I just wanted some kind of validation that God was there or that he cared. Like I'd take a hug or a punch, but just getting nothing was so hard. Because at these various points throughout my teens and 20s, I did feel like I connected with God and was close with him like a friend. But over time you wrestle with, well, was any of that even real, or was I just making it all up in my head, or what? But to, I don't know, wrap up this point, I had a good friend in high school who once said, let's not be the friends who run into each other in Walmart in 10 years and are total strangers. And yet, despite my attempts to keep in touch, that's exactly what happened. And I feel like the God I was presented with growing up offered similar promises of friendship and care, but then has failed to deliver on those. But moving on to my third complaint, I've been really hurt by purity culture. And when I say purity culture, I'm not just talking about purity rings and cringe early 2000s church gimmicks. I'm talking about how the value of virginity and purity is kind of baked into the Christian story. Like Jesus had to be born of a virgin so that he wouldn't be stained with sin or impurity, because we all know that sex is dirty and sinful, which is legit like the actual logic that St. Augustine used to form a lot of church doctrines that have become really core in Western Christianity. And we can come back to official Christian teaching at a later date, but I'm trying to keep this less ideological and more personal and experiential, which I found it weird. Maybe it's because I'm like talking to a camera, I'm used to having, when I'm doing podcasting, a lot of times I'm talking with somebody. So I'm surprised that like I haven't felt super emotional, because maybe I'm just like, explaining this stuff. I thought I would have cried by now. Not that that's a good or a bad thing, but a lot of this, I guess it's hard to convey like your mental state of being at times, but I digress. So the way I grew up with all the sexuality, I was taught both implicitly and explicitly that like all extramarital sexual activity was sinful, including masturbation or any kind of heavy petting with your girlfriend or any indulgence in these carnal desires. Like any of that put your eternal soul at risk. And there were plenty of people, really like most church people, who didn't take this very seriously at all, but I'm a little autistic, and so I obsess about things and order and structure of things, so I took it extremely seriously. So if anytime I'd masturbate, I'd just have this crippling shame and guilt and fear that if I kept doing this, like God would cast me into hell. And in the ancient world, when a lot of these sexual ethics were defined, people would get married at like 15, whereas the average American male gets married closer to 30. Then add on top of that in the modern world, we live in a sexually saturated society where every other billboard or commercial is very sexually charged, and you can access any kind of porn you want at any time at the click of a button. And even on top of that, I'm Irish, and gingers are just extra horny in general. Then you're just expected to like have zero orgasms until you're married, which may be a decade or more. And every time you do have an orgasm, you're racked with existential shame and fear that you're not actually saved. So my Christian youth was pretty plagued by this constant dilemma. And this is maybe TMI, but worth noting. Guys get morning wood. It's a legit thing, and there's biological reasons for that. But it was torture for so much of my life to just wake up to a battle. Like every day started with an all-out war to not masturbate, and that would set the stage for how your day went. And it's a catch-22 where you're trying super hard all the time to not think about sex. So by trying to not think about sex, you end up thinking about sex all the time, and it's just a doom loop. And all this came from taking pretty universal church teaching seriously. Like, these aren't just fringe interpretations, but pretty direct teachings from God and Jesus and, the church. And so that was a real mind fuck. I guess that's pretty punny. Basically, from around age 11 to 28 or something like that, it was seriously the most defining aspect of my relationship with God and Christianity, because it was the most constant. And maybe that sounds crazy, but like every day was a nonstop focus to not masturbate or watch any porn or bounce your eyes from immodest girls so they don't tempt you. And every prayer included asking God to help you keep pure or begging for forgiveness because you hadn't kept pure. And every guys group was just getting together and talking about how you'd watch porn this week and you'd try not to do it again, but then you'd meet next week and it'd just be the same thing over and over and over. Because I wasn't alone in this. If you were a devout Christian guy, this was like an all-consuming part of your relationship with God. And this led to some pretty extreme and irrational behavior, which I'm not one to really issue trigger warnings, but some of this is about to get pretty intense and traumatic on a number of levels. So if you'd just rather not, there should be little chapter sections that you can skip ahead on the bottom. But one example, when I was 15 or so, we went on a vacation to Florida, and one night I was so tired of constantly fighting my sexual urges, and this sounds crazy because my brain wasn't fully developed, but in my desperation, I swam out like 100 yards into the ocean at night, and prayed that God would either take away my sexual struggle or just sweep me away into the ocean, just because I was so tired of dealing with it. And that was so stupid and dangerous, and I didn't even know that it was stupid and dangerous because I was a young, dumb man-child, but I just kind of waited out there for a while in the water, not really knowing what to expect, and eventually just swam back to shore like, well, I guess I'm fixed and won't have this struggle anymore because he didn't sweep me away. But lo and behold, a few weeks later, I was struggling with all the same things. And then when I was 17 or 18 maybe, there was a point I was home alone and so sick of constantly struggling with sexuality that I literally got my dick out and like put a knife up to it, because I was like, well, there's that verse that if your hand causes, or your eye causes you to sin, like it's better to cut it off than to get cast into hell. So I went to grab some paper towels because I thought, I'm probably going to bleed out a lot. And the only reason I ended up not doing it was because I didn't know what I was doing, and I thought I might actually bleed out and die, and I didn't really want that. But it's just like, it messes with your brain so bad, and all that pent up sexual energy led to things that actually were shameful and harmful, like pushing boundaries with girlfriends and getting overly handsy or whatever when you knew they too were trying to keep like their pledge of purity because they were Christian, and which I don't for a second blame Christian teaching for that. Like, I took full responsibility for crossing sexual boundaries and had to do some serious soul searching and apologizing and in a particular relationship, because if you know for a fact that a girl doesn't want you to try to touch her boobs or something while you're making out, and you still try, like, you can use all these sanitized platitudes like I touched her inappropriately, but that's just a euphemism to avoid saying like sexual assault, really, because that's what it is and what I'd done, and that can't just be written off because you say, oh, you were a teenager, like things happen. Like, no, things don't just happen. Like, no matter how broken of a person you are, that's still a choice you make to respect or disrespect someone. So not only had all this, I didn't just have like unwarranted shame for my sexual struggles, but also had this totally warranted shame for what I'd done. And I was just this big, giant, messy ball of teenage hormonal, spiritually charged shame. And even though I'd learned my lesson in a lot of ways and moved on in my teens from like directly harming other people with my lack of sexual restraint, I probably didn't have a healthy, non-existentially terrifying relationship with my sexuality until I was like 28 or something. And when I was 20 was probably the only time I've actually been suicidal. And it really revolved mostly around my sexual struggles. Like, I definitely had suicidal ideation before and after that point, but this is the only time I was like close to an actual attempt. And it was mainly because I just couldn't stop masturbating and watching, or porn wasn't as big of a thing, but like no matter how much I prayed, no matter how much I fasted, no matter how much I read my Bible, I had these experiences where my sexual struggles not only hurt me, but also hurt others too. And just felt so much shame about like who I was. And I'd been feeling this way for like half my life at this point and was just finished dealing with it. And sprinkled on top of all that was this totally batshit crazy Christian teaching you may or may not have had the displeasure of hearing about, called Calvinism. That's what I was taught, is like this idea that we don't have free will and God is the one who chooses the elect to be saved and chooses the damned to be condemned, and you have confidence in if you're one of the elect or not based on if you keep sinning or not. So I just became convinced that because I couldn't stop sinning, I must be one of the damned reprobates who had no hope. So like, that's another layer. And so I went on top of this parking garage in college and just climbed up to the ledge and started like playing things out in my mind. It's probably, I don't know, like 10 stories, something like that. And I just the logic was like, since I must be one of the damned, and if I'm only going to keep hurting myself and others over the course of my life, like maybe if I ended it now, I'd prevent a lot of harm that would actually be seen as an act of love and mercy towards others. So like maybe God wouldn't judge me as harshly. And I definitely thought of my family too, which I think is a healthy form of shame. Like you don't want your family to have to go through that. But this just shows how much of a like cold, rational son of a bitch I am, that ultimately I didn't, because I thought, wait, like suicide doesn't really make sense at all. Like, at least not at this point. If I'm already going to hell and it's sort of like a, binary, like heaven or hell, like, why would I not do all the things I want to do first? Like, why not travel the world, hook up with a bunch of people, blow all my money on good whiskey, and then once I've exhausted my resources, maybe I'll feel the same and then I can kill myself. Like, that's the only suicidal path that really makes sense. And so I climbed down from the ledge and went to bed. And of course, in the following days and weeks, he realized I don't think I actually do want to kill myself, which most suicidal people don't. Like, you just want help. And a great pro tip, if you're ever feeling super depressed or suicidal, is to just go to bed. Like, you'll feel different in the morning. Like, most suicides happen at night, and they often include staying up late and drinking. But even if it's not night, one of the things I've realized as an old experienced man at the seasoned age of 31 is that, like, no matter how bad your life gets, you can always start over. Like, it's totally understandable to feel like you have nothing to live for. Like, maybe you don't have any friends, your partner left you, you lost your job, you lost your faith, and you can always find new friends or new partner, a new job, new faith. And you may even be the reason you lost those things. Like, maybe you did something stupid and humiliating, and that's why you lost your friends and your wife and your job or whatever. But you still shouldn't quit. Like, you can start again and just try to be a better person. Like, your life as you know it may be over, but you've got decades to start a new life. I think as a young person, it's hard to conceive of how long life is, and you don't realize yet that you essentially live multiple lives. Like, my life at 20 versus my life at 30 is so radically different on so many levels, it hardly seems like it could be the same life. But enough about suicide. Let's get back to sex. So, if you are a young, zealous Christian person, I don't know why you'd even be listening to this, but if you are, I'll just tell you what I wish to God someone would have told me when I was 13. Like, please just jerk off sometimes and move on with your life. Like, don't make such a massive deal out of it. There's so many bad decisions I made that I probably could have avoided if only I could have accepted a bit of good old-fashioned spanking the monkey, as they say. It's very human, it's very normal, and sure, you can get carried away with that too, but all things in moderation, right? But to reiterate, I don't know if my experience was some kind of, I don't think it was some kind of misrepresentation of Christian teaching. It was just taking what was actually taught seriously, because if all of this sexual purity stuff is a fundamental aspect of Like it's a part of the Christian story, and so it's hard for me to relate to a virgin who never sinned. Like sex and mistakes are like half of my personality. So I just increasingly had a harder and harder time relating to Jesus, and even felt some resentment towards him. Like, why does the so-called perfect hero story have to be this radical, wandering, homeless preacher? Like, why couldn't it be some degenerate who cleaned up his act, got married, had a family, and worked a normal job like 90% of humans do? And for the longest time, I thought maybe, I don't know, maybe God bypassed my dreams of rebuilding Christian community and things like that because I had too much sexual sin in my life or my past or something. And yeah, I just felt like God must be too disappointed in me to use me for anything, which again, this is like very meta, self-analyzing, but I'm like, oh, I don't feel very emotional, partially because I'm like over being so depressed about this, because these are things that like just wrecked my life, wrecked who I was. And again, part of that's just because I'm really doing great now. We'll get there eventually, but things were not great for a long time. Because the effects of purity teachings don't just stop at sexuality. Like, they really affect the treatment of women overall and have affected them for millennia. Like, even the famous verse in Paul's writings, if I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, rather she's to remain quiet, because Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became the transgressor. Like, this idea that women are more easily deceived and are also seducers of men has caused a lot of real-world harm, and it's hard to just square that with the idea that Jesus was supposed to be this final prophet who cleared things up once and for all. Like, the Hebrew and Christian traditions won't even acknowledge the feminine divine, and it seems pretty clear throughout church history that Mary became nearly deified because Christians were like, a woman could be close to God, but there's no way we'll actually refer to God as mother or she or anything feminine because women are these subordinate lesser creatures, right? I don't know. There's just so many wars and church splits and all kinds of atrocities throughout church history that would have never happened if men didn't see women as like impure or less than, and if men would have just paid a little more attention to women, or God forbid, if women were given positions of authority in the church throughout history. Like, I know a liberal Christian, or several liberal Christians, who would say, well, we've misunderstood these teachings and passages, but why would God allow his text to be so egregiously misread for thousands of years before revealing to the masses that, like, oh wait, y'all misunderstood that? Like, especially something that so dramatically affects literally half of humanity. And I don't know, if Jesus was perfect, why didn't he have clear teachings on sexual ethics or slavery or women's role in society? Like, I know he talked around all those topics and was definitely ahead of his time, but why, like, if you are literally the God man, like, why not just come out and say, hey, stop owning people, or stop treating women like property, or hey, humans are horny and complicated, here's some good ground rules for sex, but don't hurt people and don't get too wild and spread a bunch of diseases or nothing. I don't know. Christian sexual ethics have just hardly even been updated after the easy and widespread use of various forms of contraception, which is a total game changer. Like, reliable birth control has probably been probably the most influential human technology since fire, and the church has been long overdue for a spiritually guided reimagining of sexual ethics. But I'll move on to the part of the story where I just finally accepted that God, at least as I knew him, was dead, and how I reacted to that. So I had all these experiences of loss and confusion and questioning and disappointment. And as I mentioned before, if there were an official moment, it would have been Easter Day of 2021. And I don't need to tell the whole story, but basically I'd put in a lot of time and money and energy into helping put together and Easter service for our community group, and I'd driven half the night before from out of town to get back into town so that I could like be a part of the sunrise service. And but then the morning of, pretty much everyone either canceled or didn't come, and it was less a personal offense than just realizing that basically my whole life I'd given everything to God and I didn't really have anything to show for it or anything left to give. Like I was so tired of trying so hard and never seeing results, and seeing how Christianity seemed to cause more suffering to people than the lack of it, like for myself too. And after this Easter, like the afternoon of Easter 2021, my wife and we just started going at it a bit in the driveway, not like at each other, just frustratedly processing the situation because that was so much of our life. And then I stood out there for a while and eventually thought, you know what, like, this is it. Like, I'm always thinking about God, about religion, about community. It's the air I breathe, it's the water I swim in, and I'm just done. I quit. Like, I'm not going to think about those things anymore. And it was a conscious decision that, like, I'm not going to pray anymore. I'm not going to use Christianese terms. I'm not going to live my life anymore as if there's a cosmic being that's guiding events. Like, I'm going to live as if everything is up to me, because that's already been what my life experience has taught me is true. And if you want to get something done right, you got to do it yourself, you know? And I was in a weird place because I felt like an atheist emotionally, but on an intellectual level, I can't really conceive of a universe without meaning or purpose of some kind. So I figured, maybe there was some kind of God out there, but he'd probably abandoned this world a long time ago. And I felt like a foster child and wondered like what I did so wrong that made him abandon me. And I did not at all handle this well. Like, I lost motivation to do much of anything, and it'd take me forever to get out of bed in the mornings. And when my wife would go to her nursing classes early in the morning, sometimes our kid would cry for like over an hour in his crib for me to come get him, but I just wouldn't be able to get out of bed, and I'd feel awful and like shameful about it. But it was just like, why do anything if there's no God or purpose or anything? Like, life just seems like this cruel, twisted, meaningless joke. And when I was up, I wouldn't be able to work. Like, I do a lot of remote work from my computer, and this is still the tail end of the pandemic, but I just sit there and watch TV most all day and take naps here and there. And Alexis would come in when I was working and do stuff or grab something, and she'd have no idea I'd just been sitting there watching TV all day. And I, of course, felt guilt about that too, like I'm supposed to be providing for her and my family, but I just can't muster the will to care about anything. And again, this was the season where the mantra in my mind kept playing on repeat that just said, like, fuck everything, fuck everybody. Yeah, it was awful. And if you've ever seen There Will Be Blood, I honestly feel like the oil prospector, Daniel Plainview, like, when left to my own devices, like I'm just this cutthroat cynic who's done with people and just wanted to drink whiskey and live by himself and for himself. And I became pretty resentful towards Christians. Like, there's a Perfect Circle song that says, you're waiting on miracles, but we're bleeding out. Thoughts and prayers, adorable, like cake in a crisis. You sit and talk like Jesus, try walking like Jesus. Try walking your talk or get the fuck out of my way. And I felt that definitely with some unhealthy venom in it. Like, it wasn't even the bad Christians that bothered me the most. It was kind of the good ones, like not the hypocritical ones who you found out were embezzling money or something. It was the good ones who talk all this talk about love and missional community, but then we're too apathetic to make any difference in the world. I just really lost patience for it, and I was so tired of so many people suffering and literally dying, and Christians just not seeming to give a shit about any of it, because I just can't BS myself and pretend that my ideas about religion are good unless they're actually making a tangible, positive difference in the world. And I was just totally consumed by cynicism and sadness and bitterness. And it's not like I didn't want to believe in a personal, loving God. Like, who doesn't? I desperately wanted that. But all the evidence and my life experience was pointing the other way. And I didn't know how to make sense of any of that. And I don't mean to offend people who've actually lost a spouse or a child or a parent early or something, but I experienced the death of God like the death of a close loved one because this was like the closest friend you could have, God. And I even started having these heart issues, and I'd never had concerning medical issues before, but I'd have these sharp pains in my chest. And one morning it was like sleep paralysis, where it's just like chest pain and then this weird jaw pain. And and I felt like I was going to die. And I didn't even know this till later, but apparently, if you've recently lost a close loved one, your chance of a heart attack skyrockets in the following months. And sorry to keep using all these song and movie references. That's sort of how I view the world. But I don't know how many times I listened to Chop Suey, that System of a Down song, where it says like, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Why have you forsaken me? In your eyes forsaken me, in your thoughts forsaken me, in your heart forsaken me." It all felt, just so visceral and was crippling, because God was my source of hope and reason to do anything. And like, what happens when you don't just lose hope in something or someone, but you lose hope, like in hope as a concept entirely. Like, God was my anchor and pivot point, and for like how to view and interpret all of my human experiences. And I was so used to having a defining worldview. It was like, I don't know, maybe a good analogy was if my brain was some kind of storage warehouse where when I'd receive boxes, religion would tell me, "Oh, this is what this box is. This is the shelf I put it on." I could categorize all my little boxes. But then it became like that SpongeBob meme where the brain is on fire and everyone's running around trying to figure out what's going on. Like, my whole life had been so inundated with Christianity, I didn't know how to perceive anything outside of that framework. And so with no frame, is like I no longer knew how to tell which way's up, which way's down. Like, things that I used to see as awful became not that bad, and things that I used to see as good became really suspicious. And I remember asking my wife one night, like, what are we even supposed to tell our kids, like, about God or religion or meaning? Because she has her own experience perspective, but we've gone through a lot of this together and have had similar experiences. But we were talking, it's just like, are we just supposed to tell our kids that we're all just shooting in the dark and you have to give it your best shot and hope you're doing things right? I don't know. It was just so disorienting and discouraging and emotionally wrecking too, because I felt like God was the absentee father who went to the store when I was 10 to grab some cigarettes and then skipped town and never came back. And you're waiting at the window every evening thinking he might come back home from work or something, but he never does. And eventually you just stop waiting or hoping, I don't know, to a point where I was like, even if Dad did come back, I don't know what I'd do with him. Like, I don't know how he'd fit into my life. Like, I needed him when I was younger, but I don't even really need him now or know what to do with him. Or like one of my best friends who ghosted me and was older, he was like a bigger brother, and we never had any like falling out or fighting. He just fell off the face of the earth and stopped responding to anything. And after maybe 2 years of not seeing him, I went and knocked on his apartment door, which was something that I did often just to see if he'd answer. And his car was there and everything. But at this one time that I went, I knocked and I heard someone like walk to the door, watch the eye hole go black, and then footsteps walking away. And this sounds very melodramatic and teenage, but I left a note on his door that said, like, "You might not think you need me, but did you ever consider that I needed you?" Because I really needed him in those years. Like, we'd gone through a lot of things together, and he could have helped me make sense of stuff. And I don't know, just all this abandonment and disappointment really sent me spiraling. Like, I definitely had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol for a bit. And it was hard to pin down as a problem for a while, because I don't know if it's because of my Irish genetics or in spite of them, just centuries of getting sloshed, but I have a super high tolerance and just can't really get drunk. So I'd have like a quarter or a third a bottle of whiskey most every night and just thought, well, this isn't a problem. It's not like I'm getting smashed. But I was 100% doing it as a form of escapism. Like, I'd often just stay up till like 2 a.m. drinking and watching movies or YouTube videos, just because it was like static that could fill my brain and tune out everything else, and I wouldn't have to deal with reality. And then I obviously wouldn't have as much energy to work the next day because I'd stayed up late. And I've actually kept all the bottles, and I'm going to count them to use for another video of like why I stopped drinking, or why I stopped drinking at home and alone. I'll probably always drink socially, but it was a lot. It was pretty overkill, just like boxes and boxes. And another pro tip: if you're depressed, you shouldn't be drinking, especially alone, especially late at night. Like, just trust me. It's literally a depressant, and it is not going to help your situation in any way, shape, or form. Like, it'll just make the upstream swim even harder. So just forget about that. Anyway, I had all these regrets. Like, I'd spent so much of my time organizing religious community events and planning churchy stuff that I only worked part-time. So like, I was hardly making any money, and I thought, I wish I would have spent all those years that I was studying religion or trying all this community stuff, and I just would have gone to film school, or like, I've always wanted to write and direct films, or like in the 2010s, I missed out on one of the biggest wealth increases ever with the stock market and with housing prices and things like that, because I wasn't working or making money, and I felt like that put me behind. And also, a big part of why my wife didn't go to medical school was because we were trying to have time and energy for community, and she wished that she would have just gone to medical school. And like, I don't know, we've had really similar experiences, and I felt bad about that, because I felt like it's she was definitely in on, wanting to build community, but I think she let go of the dream a lot sooner than I did. And then it's not like I was forcing her to not go to medical school, but I was just so single-minded that it was like not in the cards. And I wish she would have just done that. And yeah, and because a lot of this took a pretty serious toll on our marriage. Not even because she was shaming me or fighting me about any of this. Like, I was just being negligent in so many ways, and she was trying to help me get out of this pit. And there were times where she'd ask, like, can't you just find meaning, and can't it be enough to like live for your wife and your kids and your family? And I said no, which sounds crazy, but like, in my mind, because without some way to like cosmically orient all these relationships, I didn't know like why I should even care. And I know that sounds like an absurd thing to say, but I thought, like, how can I create personal meaning for just me and my family if that meaning is just something we made up and only applies to us? Like, meaning has to be universal and real on some level for it to even make sense to me. And at one point, we visited this church group we hadn't been to for a while, and someone asked, how are you? Just like, hey, how you doing? And I straight up said, not good. Like, I'm seriously struggling, and my life is kind of falling apart, and I have no idea what to do. And obviously that caught them off guard, which you can't blame them too much for. But you could tell they were just like, what the hell, man? You're just supposed to say good. How are you? And there was another point in all this that my buddy Neil, who's been on the podcast a lot, came over and said something about Jesus. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Like, Jesus as a person had been so far off my radar for a while, when he had been like my whole life. I remember thinking, like, I feel like it's been 9 months since I've even like heard of Jesus or had a thought about Jesus. But a year went by from Easter 2021 to April 2022, and just the worst year of my life by far. And I was doing a little better, but I had basically just had on these horse blinders, just trying to like take one step at a time, day by day, just to survive and get by. Like, I'm trying not to think. None of my thoughts are about God or community or the Bible or any of the things that they had been about. So in a way, work became my religion. Like, I do wedding photography and videography, and it became what I could put all of my thought and time and energy into, which there was something that was actually good about that. It's easy to get lost in, but it was nice seeing like a return on something you did. And because business has been really great for several years now. And anyway, it's been about a year since I consciously, or it had been about a year since I'd consciously given up on faith and all that. And we went to my wife's family farm in Kansas that's about 6 hours from where we live. And I get a phone call one of the days we're there, and I pick up, and the person says, "Are you almost here? The ceremony's about to start." I'm like, "What?" I was so caught up in surviving moment to moment that I wasn't even keeping up with details, like important details, like my work schedule and weddings that I was supposed to, be at. And so we're there in Kansas. I'm flipping out, like calling every photographer I know to see if they can cover for me. No one can. It's hard to make me stressed, and I was just clearly stressed out of my mind. And the couple was super nice, all things considered, and said they just had a friend who was there with the camera and they could take pictures for them. And not that that makes it any better, like it was a small wedding and they'd only booked a few weeks beforehand, but it was written on my schedule and everything, and it was just entirely my fault. Like I wasn't paying attention, and I'm just a crying, panicked mess because this isn't like me at all. Like I'm never late to a wedding. I've never been late on a project deadline. I've never lost any footage or photos. Not to pat myself on the back, but I'm pretty methodical and hardly even make small mistakes. So going from that to essentially making the biggest mistake you can make on a professional level was humiliating. And I felt so much shame for putting the couple through that on their wedding day. I don't know. I guess because I feel like I've been let down so much, I hate letting other people down. Like I would rather crawl in a hole and die than be a problem for somebody. And I still wake up in cold sweats from time to time thinking about that day because like if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it unless there's a tsunami or an alien invasion or something. Like you can count on me doing what I say. And to have such an egregious breach of trust and professionalism on the biggest day of someone's life, it was just almost too much for me to handle. And I knew this was a problem before. Like I knew my mind was foggy all the time. And even months before, I had a concerning situation where I was having trouble with facial recognition of someone I knew well. So my mind was just this unreliable, constantly changing landscape. But on that day, I missed the wedding. I was talking to my wife outside on the farm, and I knew that this was all because of my mental and spiritual decline, and I was crying and could hardly talk, which has maybe happened like 3 times in our 11-year relationship. And for the first time, I actually said it out loud and told her, like, I feel like it's so unfair that we gave so much to God and he didn't care and none of it worked out. And it was like just vocalizing that was really cathartic, just to like say how you feel, because we were like, both of us were the devout of the devout. And if God didn't even show up for us, like what hope does the average person even have? Again, not like trying to be proud or like think of ourselves really highly, but like we were obsessed with our faith. And I don't know, after that, I just, I know I really had to get my act together because things like this were just going to continue to happen. And if I didn't get better, like, I don't know, I just had to get better. Like there was no option. And I was still having the heart issues too. So it essentially came down to like, I'm going to have to find a way out of this depression hole or my heart is literally going to kill me. It was like Stanley in The Office where he can't raise his blood pressure. And I knew I had to find a way to just believe and love again. And that largely included paying more attention to my wife, Alexis, who again has been a literal lifesaver for me over the years. And I think women in general are much better at making peace with mystery. But at the time, I felt like I needed order and structure and direction, like hard truths to tell me my place in the world. So it took a lot of unlearning and relearning to accept how little we really know and be okay with that. And really the key thing that brought me out of my nihilistic spiral was, ready for it, love. And that's cliche and overly simple, but also not really. So if there is actually divine providence, I could maybe see it and that I had a kid before I went all the way down this spiral, because I don't know if I would have escaped the mental pit I was in without I don't know, just what my kids showed me through their love and my love for them. And I don't know that your family or your spouse should be a good enough reason to get better, but it's just different with kids. Like my son would fall asleep in his crib with his hand hanging out to the side, and I just lay there on the floor and hold his hand in that dark season sometimes. And that was the closest I'd really come to praying, just thinking, like, I refuse to believe that this connection I have with my kid is just neurons firing to promote my genetic survival. Yeah, just knowing I wanted to be a better man for him, and knowing that desire was real and true in the deepest part of my soul, and not just because of some biological evolutionary reason. Atheism really seems to imply that there's no inherent meaning to life or the universe, and that love is just a survival mechanism. And even in the darkest days of my nihilism, that was a hard pill for me to swallow, at least on an intellectual level. I definitely felt that way, but just that idea, I don't know, seems kind of ridiculous when I think about it. Like I said, I was more emotionally atheist, but could never quite get to full-blown atheism as an ideology because it was just a little too far-fetched. Like, how could there be no inherent meaning to life? Like, that seems so self-defeating. Like, no one really lives as if everything is meaningless. Like, I really love my wife. It's not just hormonal urges so that we'll reproduce. Like, I genuinely love her heart and her soul, and I believe that love is real. And no, that's not an entirely rational argument. It does take a leap of faith, but I think that leap of faith is far less absurd than the leap of faith it takes to say that nothing matters in the end. And I think that's part of why my perspective and like faith of community, like why I was so tied to community, because the farther I get away from community, the harder it is for me to see God, and vice versa. The way I see God most is in the moments of connection and love between people. And as I mentioned, my two close friends who passed, one was straight up suicide, but the other was a drug overdose that was induced because of the depressive state he was in, and he'd never done any hard drugs. It was just circumstantial that he was depressed, and this that was like his way out. But the day that I found out, I was driving home and turned on the Christian radio station that has sermons and things like that playing, and it was playing John Piper, who's this super popular preacher in evangelical circles, and he was preaching about how God despises the wicked and sinners and is eagerly waiting to punish them once they die. I think there's some verse in the Old Testament about God whetting his sword in eager anticipation to punish those who don't repent. And that was obviously off-putting, to say the least, given what had happened that day. But that night, I had a dream that was so clear and vivid. It was almost like a vision of sorts, not to like paint myself as some sort of mystic, but it was like the frame of a movie, and I just saw like this extreme close-up of the face of Jesus just weeping, and it was really comforting, as if to say, like, we aren't alone in all of this, and there is a higher being or higher beings who care and suffer with us and cry when we cry. Like, whoever God is, if, like, I don't think maybe he doesn't hate us, like, isn't looking to punish us, and he's actually for us. And that's really the only way I conceive of divinity now, because life in nature is just so brutal and antagonistic as it is. So what hope do any of us have if God is against us too? Like, I can't believe that people just suffer, then die, then that's it. Like, especially the billions of people that have not only had like painful deaths, but extremely painful lives too. Like, there has to be some sort of cosmic accounting that makes it all right somehow. Donnie Darko, the Jake Gyllenhaal film from like 2001, is, for one, surprisingly one of the strangest but most inspiring and emotive movies ever, that grapples with providence and finding God and making peace with death and the value of self-sacrificial love. And if you want to watch it, there's watch the director's cut. Like, it's much easier to follow than the theatrical version. But there's the scene where Donnie is talking to his therapist, and I'm just going to actually play that whole 90-second clip.
Donnie, what did Roberta Sparrow say to you?
She said that every living creature on Earth dies alone.
How did that make you feel?
It reminded me of my dog, Callie. She died when I was 8, and she crawled underneath the porch.
To die.
To be alone.
Do you feel alone right now?
Uh, I mean, I'd like to believe I'm not, but I've just never seen any proof, so I just don't debate it anymore, you know? It's like I could spend my whole life debating it over and over again, weighing the pros and cons, and in the end, I still wouldn't have any proof, so I just don't debate it anymore. It's absurd.
The search for God is absurd?
It is if everyone dies alone.
Does that scare you?
I don't want to be alone.
So admittedly, I know that's pretty melodramatic, and I can have all my grandiose ideas and questions and put on my man face and pretend this is all a wrestle of wits and philosophy and life experience, but I think a lot of it boils down to still having this childlike fear of not wanting to be alone. Like, I'm afraid that everything that's good doesn't last, and it all eventually slips through your fingers like sand, and you'll just end up alone with no place in the world, like wasting away in some nursing home with AI bots taking care of you. So the search for God really is absurd if it's just about an individualistic personal enlightenment and not some vision of togetherness with other people, which is always what I wanted out of Christianity. Like, our first kid was very emotional, and it was a struggle. He'd have these nuclear level meltdowns, which I apparently had. I was the same when I was a kid, and eventually, like, he'd get overwhelmed and have these meltdowns, and eventually he'd just cry out and say, be close," which meant he just wanted you to pick him up and let him lay his head on your chest and try to take some deep breaths and recover. Even now, he's about 5, and he'll often come into the room in tears because everyone who was previously in the room left, and he'll say, I don't want to play by myself, and he's really upset that everyone's gone, and that's just really like what we all want, right? Like, it's such a human universal to want to be with people, and we just want people to do life with and a place to lay our heads. And that's another reason all this community stuff is so visceral to me. Like, I want a better future for my kids. Like, I don't want them to feel alone, and I don't want them to turn 20 and say, why are we so disconnected from everybody, or all the things that we say now and complain about now. Like, I want to fix those things, and I want them to be a part of something bigger than themselves if they want to, that they know is, solid like a rock and will enable them to both give and receive from that community of caring and intelligent and artistic and visionary people. Like, there's this famous Dostoevsky quote that beauty will save the world, and I really think modern religious apologists have gone astray by trying so hard to defend faith through a more scientific and philosophic and historic lens, and less through song and dance and painting and togetherness and some of these things. Like, so much of what's kept any form of faith alive in me has been films and music and art and just like dinners with people, like warm times with friends and family, and like Terrence Malick movies and Sleeping at Last albums, and these works that wrestle with faith and beauty and love. And it seems like Christians should be at the forefront of visionary art, but as we all know, that's not quite the case. Christian movies are just the absolute worst. And but I'll give it credit where it's due. That Christian music has gotten a lot better over time. But I digress. Another life hack I wanted to share that I learned in this season of rediscovering meaning is that when you feel lost in life and don't know which way you should go, the best thing you can do is really to help the people right in front of you. And I found that helped me take the focus off me and my problems and gave me just enough light to take the next step that I needed to. Like, if someone I knew went through something awful recently, I'd try to have them over for dinner or a movie night or whatever and just be a friend and try to think about, someone else's problems for a bit. And it seemed like every time I do that, it'd open some mental or emotional door that'd take me to the next place that I needed to be. I've heard that nihilism is easier than faith because your options are to either believe that nothing matters or the inverse, which is actually more intimidating, that everything matters. Like every action you take has meaning and creates the world that you live in. So believing everything was meaningless made me so cynical and bitter. And I got to a point that I didn't want to be bitter anymore. Like I wanted to create the world, be the change you want to see in the world. And I genuinely have worked through that because of my belief in love. And that ties me to my second biggest problem with atheism, which is, I know it's an age-old critique of atheism, but I think it actually holds water pretty well. And that's the question of like, how can you ground morality if there is no such thing as objective morality? Like, how can you say anything is fundamentally good or bad and not just a matter of popular opinion? It's a classic question, but it's a pretty damn good one. And dear listener, if you haven't already lost respect for me, you're about to, just seeing how, like, my deep dive into total moral relativism. So, okay, objective morality, that's like a fancy term. But to simplify that into more everyday examples, if there were no God or meaning or afterlife or everything or anything, life would be pretty much just about amassing the most amount of dopamine and pleasure possible before you die, which means that it's not like you'd go around raping and murdering a bunch of people because you'd go to prison and that'd curtail your pleasure pretty quick. But if you wanted to live a life consistent with your atheism, you'd only be deterred by things that would seriously ruin your pleasure, like death or jail, which is, that's kind of how I lived for a while. Like, if it wasn't going to put me in jail, why not lie, cheat, steal, do whatever, if like none of it is objectively wrong? So I was a real asshole for a while, and hardly anybody even knew it because I didn't want to be seen as an asshole. I just wanted to be one. Like, my kid would have a stinky diaper and I'd think, I don't want to change that. Like, that doesn't bring me pleasure. My wife will do it when she gets home. And like, that's such an asshole move, but it's like I was trying to be consistent, and I'm a nice enough guy in general that I can get away with, like, no one would have suspected that underneath I was just fuming with rage and resentment towards everything and like everybody, and especially myself. I used to be so reliable, like I talked about, but sometimes I'd forget to call a client or something, and when we finally connected, I'd just lie and say, oh, this or that thing happened, when really I just forgot. Like, getting caught in a lie can complicate life and cut down on your pleasure, but if there's like a 99% chance you're not going to get caught for some lie that will make your life easier, why not just take the risk if it's not a matter of objective or like cosmic morality? And it would manifest in more significant ways too. Like, I eventually lost a lot of shame about staying up late and drinking and having no energy to work the next day because I just thought, like, well, I enjoy whiskey and being entertained, and it's only a societal construct that I'm supposed to provide for my family. Or probably the worst, maybe the worst thing I did, I was at an event and my son was maybe 2 and climbing up and down some stairs, and one of my friends was there in the same spot, and I was just laying around some, and my kid fell down some of the stairs, so I went to comfort him, make sure he was all right, like he was all right, and my wife came over because he heard him crying and asked what happened, and I just blamed it on my friend who was there and just said, like, oh, he was helping him, but then he fell, like, just because I thought I'm not in the mood to be berated by her for not being attentive enough of our kid. Like, I just don't want to deal with that right now, so I'm gonna lie and like push it off on my friend. And I know you're thinking, like, wow, you are psychotic and a terrible person, which is true, but I was legitimately trying to live in a way that was consistent with like this nihilistic worldview. And at the time, like, even if you thought that I was a bad person for doing something or not doing something, I didn't care, because you're just one of 8 billion hominids with your own personal opinion and I've got mine, and there's no objective standard to judge between us, so why fuss about it? I obviously feel awful about all of this now, but at the time, as wild as it sounds, I just thought, like, I don't want to be a hypocrite and live in a way that doesn't align with my worldview, even though I now have a very different worldview. Like, I still think back to when I was living that way, and it was pretty consistent with, like, my worldview as a more of an atheist, like maximizing personal pleasure, which means minimizing anything that would get in the way of that. Like Richard Dawkins is someone I respect immensely, and I think he has so many insightful things to say, but there's a clip on YouTube I saw where he's asked, is rape objectively wrong? And he just says, I'm glad I live in a society where rape is considered wrong. Because, yeah, him and Alex O'Connor and many leading atheist figures are more than willing to, like, explicitly admit that morality is mostly just socially agreed upon norms, but there's nothing universal and certainly nothing transcendent about morality. But then most atheists don't live in a way that's, like, radically and ruthlessly committed to maximizing their pleasure. And so, ironically enough, when I was a Christian, I got so annoyed by Christians who didn't live consistently with their beliefs. Then on the flip side, when I became more atheistic, my biggest problem with atheists was the same thing. Like, you atheist folks are all sorts of religious. Like, you're so swayed by human emotion and cultural traditions rather than by pure calculated logic. And just like I didn't half-ass Christianity, I didn't half-ass atheism either. So, I don't know, to me now, the idea that there is no objective morality is like an idea so stupid, only a philosopher could have come up with it, like someone who went to college for a really long time. And I hope all my rambling hasn't come off as too heady or philosophical, because I really like to keep things on an everyday person level, because I definitely think of myself as like an everyday person. I like life experience and specific examples over, like, theoreticals and hypotheticals and, like, kind of, I don't know, airy ideas. But I knew the way that I was living wasn't sustainable. But again, it was more an emotional argument, not a rational one, because I was living rationally, even though my conscience kept nagging me for, I don't know, for like a long time. I just shut that off because I thought the conscience is just an evolutionary development to help us more easily cooperate and live in community, but it's contrary to your own personal ambitions to achieve more pleasure. So just flip the switch. And yeah, I just thought atheists who get bothered by their conscience just aren't smart enough to bypass their evolutionary wiring. That's what I thought. Yeah. So as an atheist, I guess the thing I found most intellectually anathema was self-sacrificial love, because it's like the opposite of survival of the fittest. Like, why would you sacrifice anything valuable to you unless you're going to gain something out of it? It's just irrational unless you're going to gain some subjective sense of happiness from doing it. Like, maybe then it makes sense, but, like, why? I think if I became an atheist before having kids, I probably wouldn't have even had them, because they require so much sacrifice of your time and energy and money and thought and everything. And the main benefit of having children is in the meaning they bring to your life. But I mean, guess what? The world is meaningless. If, like, that was the frame of mind I was in, I probably sound like a mad scientist. And you can call me a cold son of a bitch, but because I was, but I don't think you can call me, like, inconsistent or unscientific. And atheists will say, well, if everyone lived a totally selfish life like I had, like I'd been living at the time, like, the world would be an awful place, which is true. But as an atheist, I was like, well, that's not my problem. And it doesn't change the facts. Like, I'm glad there are people in the world who still believe in objective morality, and I was more than content to continue reaping the benefits of Western Christian morality and charity and society. But if the fact of the matter is that life is survival of the fittest, like, it's just a ruthless climb to the top to accumulate the most of whatever you want, whether that's money or sex or status or, whatever. So, Yeah, that's the story of how I became the world's biggest asshole, and hopefully sharing where I'm at now in part 2 can redeem myself in your eyes a bit, to not view me just as this insane, toxic, hopeless person, because I'm obviously not that way anymore. And like I already explained it was these moments of connection and love that with people that really made me take that step of faith again, to believe that there was purpose to life. Like maybe because I'm just a male who's not emotionally evolved enough, but I felt like I really needed to separate this video as best as I could into 2 parts of like emotions and experiences and the actual ideas, because I didn't want to get lost in my default of trying so hard to like qualify my ideas and think of my brain, and like lose sight of the things I was so viscerally feeling and experiencing through all this. So in part 2, I'll go through more of the questions of like, well, now do I believe in God? Like, would I label myself agnostic, still Christian, atheist? Do I believe in prayer or hell or the Bible or any of that? I've probably shared more than I should with the internet about my personal life, but I felt like it was worthwhile to share these emotions and experiences that have left me suspended between some form of somewhat mystical Christianity and a humanistic agnosticism. But I don't know. I feel like where I've ended up is similar to where a lot of people have ended up in their own way. Yeah. So if you've made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you hearing out this random guy's eccentric ups and downs, and you can listen to part 2 right here.